Hello and welcome to your Ageless Musical Brain podcast, where we take you on a journey on how to intentionally use the power of music to promote your own brain health long term. Today's focus, the importance of movement, momentum, and the science of dance. My very special guest today and subject matter expert is a human movement scientist who specializes in dance science and dance for health. He's worked with elderly adults and people with neurological diseases such as Huntington's and Parkinson's disease in relation to brain health. He has dedicated his life to helping communities improve their movement and increase heightened awareness of the importance of motion, balance, and finding strength and stability using evidence-based approach. He is my very special guest, human movement scientist, Gregory Youdan. Very happy to have you on the show. Welcome, Gregory.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So let's start by letting our audiences know more about the crucial connection between brain health, dance, neuroscience.
So dance science can mean many different things, right? Like dance science is just the scientific study of dance, right? That can be a neuroscientific approach where we're studying it from what's happening in response to dance with the brain, such as in Dance for Health, or the neuroscientific response of professional dancers. But it can also be a more movement science-based approach, looking at the biomechanics of how the body actually moves itself.
How about human movement and how that's affected by neurological diseases?
So there's a lot of overlap actually between different neurological conditions, right? But there's not one way that the body responds to neurological conditions. For example, Parkinson's and Huntington's disease are both diseases of the basal ganglia, which is a part of the brain, right? But they manifest very differently, right? Parkinson's, for example, is due to the death of the dopaminergic neurons, right? Or that their brain doesn't produce enough dopamine. Whereas Huntington's is a genetic disorder, and the only way to get it is if one of your parents had it. And the manifestations of those are very different. In Parkinson's disease, you might get something like a tremor, right? Or a shaking movement. Or you might experience something like freezing, where you're unable to move. Or your movement might get a lot smaller and it becomes harder to move. Whereas Huntington's, on the other end of the spectrum, has chorea, which chorea actually comes from the Latin word for dance, right? Or choreography also comes from that. So chorea is more uncontrollable movements, right? Or jerky movements, or they have an excess of movement, right? And that is being affected by the Huntington's disease, right? But the other thing to note is that even though, right, Huntington's and Parkinson's disease are both neurological conditions that are affecting movement, it's not just a movement disorder, right? It's also affecting cognition. It's also affecting behavior and psychology, right? So all of these are multifaceted diseases that do have a motor component or a movement component, and the movement component oftentimes serves as the face of the disease, right? And what I mean by that is that it's the first thing that's noticeable, right? Or we don't tend to go in to see a doctor until we've had motor symptoms of the disease. I think Huntington's is a lot rarer of a disease, right? So not as many people even know about Huntington's. And the thing is, Huntington's is a very family disease, right? Because the only way for you to get it is if one of your parents had it. And if one of your parents had it, you have a 50-50 chance of getting it because it's a dominant gene, right? So there's there's this sense of, if you've had it, you've seen a parent or a family member go through it, so you kind of know what's happening. But the thing is, even if we know, right, there's still, how do we find joy in what we're doing, right? And how do we come to life, right? And for me, right, that was dancing. And for many people, right, it's dancing and music or some form of art and community. So what I get to do is build programs that I come in. With Huntington's, it can be a little bit harder because people are more spread out. Like, unless you live in a city, right, you might be a little bit more rural, but we can still build it in the virtual world of where you come together and we do movement, right? And the thing is, a lot of the research has actually shown that exercise is really beneficial for brain health, right? One of the theories behind it is that there's increased blood flow, and that increased blood flow increases the blood flow to the brain, and that in turn has a neuroprotective effect, right? And that can potentially slow down some of the progression of these diseases. It's a little bit harder with Huntington sometimes because they have the excess movement of the chorea. With the excess movement, they're burning calories, right, all day. So the nutritional aspect also becomes important for them to actually make sure that they're eating or getting enough food into their system so that they can actually participate in these dance classes and do, or an arts program in general.
Social prescribing is an alternate solution for many people that suffer from loneliness and depression. Could you expand on that?
Yeah. So social prescribing, I believe, was started in the UK and the United Kingdom. And it's this idea of the arts and culture and recreation being a avenue, right, or a venue to kind of combat, one, the loneliness epidemic that we're facing, right, and kind of depression, where we don't necessarily have the same social support, right? And the thing is, what I mean by that is not that there's all of our needs are individual, right? Like, I might have two really good friends and that satisfies my social need, where somebody else might actually need more connection to have that same satisfaction, right? So there's not a one size fits all. But what has been really piloted in the UK and a lot of other countries at this point, and we've got some pilot programs that are happening here in the US as well, is where your doctor or your medical provider can actually write a social prescription, right? And this social prescription is covered by insurance, right, in the UK, but in the US we kind of still haven't quite figured out how to get that done through the healthcare system. It's often backed by a lot of private funders, but in essence, your medical provider refers you, right, to, in the UK it's a link worker. We might call that a social worker here, where they get to pair you, right, with different things that are already in your community, right, things that are happening. Maybe that's a Dance for Parkinson's class that you come to, and you have a social network, right, of people that you see in a community that you see. Maybe that's actually a hiking group that you go out and you walk around and talk about nature, right? There's not this one size fits all, but they find what your personal interests are, right, and try to make a connection for you to kind of foster that network. Maybe that's going to see a theater show, right? And the thing is that the social worker would call you before to let you know, we've got you tickets to see this show. And then they would call you afterwards and ask you questions about how the show went and what you liked and what you didn't like. Maybe they go with you if you need that type of support and connection, right? But it's realizing that there's also a need for the social connection, right? And this social network that happens. And oftentimes in neurological conditions, or even just with aging, we tend to isolate or remove ourselves, right? And distance ourselves. I don't want to be a burden on other people. I don't want to burden them with my disease or with what I'm going through. And that also has a toll on ourselves, right? So this social prescribing model is one way, right, that the arts and culture and dance, right, can help to combat this loneliness epidemic that was really highlighted by the COVID pandemic.
Is social prescribing offered only in England, or has it expanded to other parts of the world?
It's spread to a lot of other countries around the world, and the US is not one that does not have social prescribing like we do. There was a pilot project that happened in Massachusetts. There's also Arts Pharmacy that has been doing a lot of this work in Atlanta, Georgia. And they're getting prescriptions, right, or referrals from doctors, right, or physicians. And then they get paired up with this link worker or this social worker that basically allows them to tell them all of the different things that are happening in their community and create access and opportunity to those items, right? Like, why aren't you going to this dance class that's happening? Oh, I can't get a ride there. Okay, well, maybe we can set you up with a bus to get you to this dance class so that you can go back and forth, right? Or, one of the things that I did, this isn't social prescribing per se, but when I worked at Brown for a year, I worked with a program called Dance for All People. And it was through Brown University, but the students were taking a class, and then the older adults came to take this dance class. And we paired one of the students, right, with one of the older adults, and they met outside of class once a week, right, for a phone call or a Zoom call to just talk about what was going on in their lives, right? And many of them formed long-lasting friendships that lasted longer than the class, right? Because they found these shared interests.
And what about caregivers, Gregory? What suggestions or advice do you have for them, being that, especially nowadays, a lot of family members are taking care of their own and they're exhausted? They go to work and it's like having two jobs.
If you're not in a good state, how are you going to be able to impart and kind of take care of somebody else, right? I think that one of the beauties of the programs that I get to be a part of, right, is that these are not just specific to the person with Parkinson's, for example. Caregivers and family members can come and be a part of this program, right? And it ends up being a moment for you as well as a moment for them, right? It's something that you get to share and experience together, but it's also something that can kind of take your mind away and into this whole other space, right? Whether that's, we're talking about just well-being in general, like maybe that's making sure that your nutrition is taken care of. Maybe that's meditation for you, but maybe also there's that place of, where do you find joy? What are the things that bring you joy? And how are you able to make time for yourself with that? Like, I might not be able to make it into a dance class this week. It's too stressful. I'm doing too much caregiving. But maybe I can put on my iPhone for 15 minutes and dance around my living room, right? Or maybe I can dance with the person that I'm taking care of, right? And just kind of have this moment together, right? There's not one way to do this. There's many ways to do this, right? And what are the ways that you and your family members gravitate to, and what brings you joy?
The things I find so effective about social prescribing is how different generations connect to each other. In one event, you can have millennials communicating with Gen Z, Generation X, and even baby boomers.
So that was an intergenerational dance program that we had, right? And the thing is, we all have a need for social connection, right? Like, even if I'm more introverted, and my need for social connection might be different from somebody else, but at the end of the day, we still want to know that we're in a community with other people, right? And finding those shared interests, and also, a lot of the younger students ended up seeing themselves in the older adults, right? Or the older adults started seeing and remembering and sharing stories of when they were in college or when they were younger. So there's this real kind of shared humanity, right, that everybody comes to. And the other thing is, in a lot of these arts programs, when it comes back to this idea of social prescribing, right, you're also creating something together. You're creating that dance, or you're creating a mural, right? Or you're creating music together, and you have that sense for the community, right? And the well-being and who the people are around you.
Stigma, right? That stigma about the meaning that's attached to dance music and the arts, that there's a period of time for it, or there's an age range for it.
Jill Sonke's lab at the University of Florida, and many others that I can't name everyone, right? But they've looked at how arts participation is actually a public health behavior, right? And that participating in arts in one way or another, or in cultural activities, can actually improve longevity of life, right? So coming back to that essence too, with like the communities and kind of what we're thinking about, right? It is, you hit on it specifically with like the cultural buy-in, right? Where different cultures view it differently, as maybe something that's leisure, but also maybe that's how I view it for myself. I find that the people that come and take a dance for Parkinson's or a dance for Huntington's class for the first time are super brave. And I really mean that, how brave they are, because oftentimes they've gone, I'm not a professional dancer. That's not for me. I can't possibly do that, right? But then they come in and they see that this is an inclusive and accessible class that we do in at least for 30 minutes in a chair where we're all together. And then if we move to standing, there's still a teacher that's in a chair, or a teaching artist, right? So that you get to make choices, right? And you get to make choices about how you're participating in the class. You're getting to make choices about what movements you're doing, right? That anybody can do it. Or maybe you're just coming into the class to sit there and listen to the music, and that's also okay. This is a space for everybody. But taking that first leap into knowing that this is a space for everyone, that's a really brave step. I mean, I think also, so this is another side story, right? But I think we all push on, I have to do something to be really good at it in our society. Like, if I'm going to take a dance class, I have to improve and I have to get to be the best and a professional dancer, or why am I taking this class, right? But that's actually not true. I can just take this class because it brings me joy. The thing too is, even if we're going from that brain perspective, right? Like, there's the arborization of the neurons actually growing, right? And spreading out and creating new dendrites and all of that, which happens when we put ourselves in new activities with new learning, right? So like, just the fact that I'm trying to like learn something new, right? That does a lot for the brain health.
I still think that there's this huge gap in which people still need to connect to that idea that, hey, you have to go out, you have to connect with other people. That's where the brain health benefits are.
Really hard, I think, in a lot of these neurological conditions too, where depression and apathy are a symptom of the disease, right? So like now, not only have I been diagnosed, but I'm also having apathy where I don't want to do things, and then I'm also depressed and I'm also lonely, right? So yes, I also want to uplift, right, the cultural community bearers who've been doing this work for many, many years, right? And it doesn't always even get labeled as health work, right, or public health work, but they're in their communities making a difference, right? The issues a lot of times are through these programs or through these other avenues, it's through word of mouth, right? And we're still in these grassroots areas of like, oh, this might be happening, but no one told me about it, or I don't know. Like, I live down the street from this community center that offers 12 different classes, but I've never stepped in, so I don't even know, or like, that's not a place for me to go. But it's like, hey, actually, they're free, and like, I can do these things, or like, my friend down the street goes there, or we can go together, even, right? So I think that there's still work. There's a lot of work being done, and there's so many people that are doing it, and it is continuing to grow, which I think is amazing and wonderful. But there's still work that needs to be done and growing, and getting people to actually believe in it, and the amount of the research that's doing, right? It captures that moment, and it captures, like, I mean, in our Dance for Parkinson's classes, for example, through the Mark Morris Dance Group in Brooklyn, 15 minutes before and after, more or less, right, we open the space, whether it's a virtual Zoom room or it's a physical space, for people to come in and say hello to each other, right? How are you doing? I remember last week, it was your birthday. Did you do anything for your birthday, right? To give people that moment and that time for that social element around, right, the arts participation. So I was on vacation with my partner, and we were in Marrakesh in Morocco, right? And we were on one of the tours, and then they had this group of musicians that were playing, and the tour guide goes, "These are our musicians. We've always thought of our musicians as healers." And I was like, "Yes, please tell me more about this," right? And he was like, "Well, back in the day, we used to think, or we thought, right, that music really helped with epilepsy. And like, they would play these different tunes, right? And like, it's been shown that scientifically, right, like that's the case and through the brainwaves. But I don't think that we always go back to, right, the kind of ethos of, a lot of times in early societies, artists were also seen as healers, right? And we've moved away from that a lot of times, which, yes, there's also like the need for pharmacological interventions and like science of vaccines and all the wonderful things that come back to, right? But there's also still that humanity, right, that we can come back to, and the powers of joy and well-being and community, and how do we bring people together, because that also has an uplifting motivational quality.
Especially when you don't have a neurological disease, and you go there with a preventive, positive mentality.
I have my Instagram page, which is at Greg Youdan, or my Facebook page, which is at the same, but my website is gregory.youdan.com, and that kind of keeps up to date with what I'm doing. I will also recommend people to go to Dance for Parkinson's, which is the Mark Morris Dance Group's page, because those classes are both in person and virtual. I teach for them. I also teach in their program in Spanish, where we get people all around the world that come to it, but they're freely available, right? So if you find this podcast and you're not in New York City, there's online classes that you can join that are free, right? So there's something for everybody that you can come and do.
Thank you, Gregory, so much for joining me on the show and creating value to communities that need it the most.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.